Okay, our next segment here on the doctrine of the Trinity, I've already established why the concept is crucial for Christians, but now just a few other things. Then we'll look at some Trinitarian objectives, or objections, I should say. First of all, the word Trinity. One of the objections that comes up, and I'll deal with this, is that groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll come to you and say, well, you know, the word Trinity isn't even in the Bible. And that's when you slap your head and go, you're not really going to use that as an argument, are you? Because, yeah, the English word Trinity is simply an abridged version of triunity, like 3 in 1, okay? That's what it means. And so it doesn't matter that the word itself is not in the Bible. The question is the concept in the Bible? And that's why we're going to spend a lot of time establishing that, yes, the Bible teaches the facts for the doctrine of the Trinity. And for this, again, so it's just a non-starter. And Jehovah's Witnesses use all sorts of, quote, non-biblical terms like theocracy, which they claim are biblical concepts. Well, great. But if you really want to press the matter, there aren't any English words in the Bible. They're all Greek and Hebrew, okay? So yeah, so don't use that. It's a bad argument that the word Trinity isn't in the Bible. Then when we approach the doctrine of the Trinity, there's a couple of ways we can do it. One, the ontological Trinity, which is mostly what we're going to be doing here in our doctrine class, which is ultimately we look at the being of the triune God and trying to understand how by nature God is 3 in 1. But then we can, really consider issues, which we will do a little bit, on the economic Trinity, which is not only how is God 3 in 1, but how does God work or function as a triune God. And this is significant, again, for Trinitarians because it's easier for a Unitarian to explain how the one God works. Because when we say, for example, God saves us, well, it's the Trinity that saves us, okay? And yet, it's the one God who saves us. Yet we can distinguish the distinct Trinitarian operations in the one divine work of salvation. So that's going to be something we'll explore a little bit. And then we'll get into later on different models for the Trinity. Like I said, we'll think about, what does it mean to be at a group mind model, how many wills are in the Trinity, and so forth. We'll unpack that a little bit later. But now, at the bottom of page 1, what I want to address are sort of the common objections to the doctrine of the Trinity. And remember that, too, that these are the objections usually raised by anti-Trinitarian groups like Muslims, like Jehovah's Witnesses, which are sort of the classic Arian theology modernized, or modalists, again, who are anti-Trinitarians, okay? And when I say modalist, I mean modalistic monarchians, aka Sabellians, which we'll look at that a little bit later, which say that, that the God of the Bible is only one person, and that one person just plays different roles at different times. There aren't actually 3 persons who exist eternally and simultaneously as the one God. So that's when I say modalism, that's what I mean. So these are most of the common objections that are raised by these groups. So I want to deal with them, but you got to remember too that what really underlies the objections is this, and it's that these people really think that if you have 3 persons, somehow necessarily you've got 3 gods. If you've got 3 gods, you've got polytheism. If you have polytheism, you have paganism. If you have paganism, it means that you've got an idol and you've abandoned the true and the living God. So when you look at these anti-Trinitarian groups, you have to really remember that their motivation is to preserve true monotheism in their mind. And while they don't necessarily use the term necessarily, they think it necessarily follows that if you have 3 persons, you've got 3 gods. And this is why no matter how many good biblical arguments you give for this, in their minds, until you remove the necessarily part, they're going to say, I can't believe in the Trinity because I'm going to be a pagan and have an idol. So that's why we're going to spend some time showing how to remove the necessarily part, which I already did in previous lectures when we talked about distinctions. See, if you make a real distinction, right, between the persons of the Trinity, yes, You've divided them into three independently existing substances that are now three gods. And this is why you need to introduce the concept of, again, distinctions before you go into this. So, what's a formal distinction? What's a modal distinction? What is a ratiocinative distinction? There, again, if all you've got is real and essential distinction, then your mind is going to automatically go to three gods. Or as one of my good friends always said, is if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, okay? So again, open it up with distinctions. And before I dive into the objections, I'll just actually give you a way to repeat what I said earlier and how you can use the distinctions. So for example, Jehovah's Witnesses who are anti-Trinitarians will say, yeah, somehow three persons equals three gods, three independent things. So if you make them work through that, they're going to say really mentally three persons equals three gods. But before you do that, here's what you want to do. You bring up the divine attributes issue. And as I mentioned, divine attributes should not be distinguished essentially or really, or you end up with a bunch of parts of God. You end up with a composite being. So actually, we end up doing this ratiocinatively or even formally as ways of distinguishing the divine attributes. But you start either with a Muslim or a Jehovah's Witness and say, look, okay, you believe God is one. How do you deal with the divine attributes? Say, ask the Jehovah's Witness, say, let's just say for the sake of argument, Jehovah, the one true God, has 30 attributes. Does that mean there's 30 separate, infinite, eternal, self-existing parts to Jehovah? Are there really 30 eternal things, 30 infinite things? And lay this out for them, because most Jehovah's Witnesses have simply never thought about this question. So all of a sudden now you're going to raise the distinction issue with them. And so, you lay it for them and say, well, what would be the problem of Jehovah having essentially being made of 30 parts? Well, and then you raise, well, would Jehovah really be independent? Would Jehovah be more mutable than he should be? And so on and so forth. And then if you've got 30 parts, one part is love, one part is this, how do the persons fit into all this? Is that another part of God? Say, you end up with all sorts of problems when you think about a person as a mode of a rational essence, which I talked about before. So now that you've laid the foundation for that, see, you set them up, right? So you set them up with, okay, so what we can say based on, I don't know, modal or formal or ratiocinative distinction, that even though there are maybe 30 different distinguished conceptions of God in the Scripture, God is still one, right? You don't have 30 little God pieces coming together to make one God, because you don't have to necessarily separate these things into independent substances, right? Wink a little bit at them, right? And say, right? And then once they agree to that, then you say, okay, so you can agree there's some sense that Jehovah is 30 in one, right? Right? And by the way, psychologically, it helps when you get them to admit this stuff up front. See, they can't take it back later if they admitted it up front. So then you say, well, if you don't have a problem with Jehovah being 30 in one, why do you have a problem necessarily with him being 3 in one? Silence in heaven for half an hour after that. See, they already gave it up with the distinctions issue. See, now it's not so hard to go from 30 in one to 3 in one, okay, with persons as a mode of the essence, which I'll distinguish a little bit more at the end of this study. So that's why initially, as we start to do this, you've got to understand that, going through verse after verse after verse about the deity of Christ, the Jehovah's Witnesses say, I just can't agree to this because I'm going to be a pagan like you if I actually agree to it. So this is why they're going to constantly argue against any of the good arguments you give until you've removed their objections. Okay, the necessarily objections. That's how it'll make your time a lot better. So, all right, so methodologically now, what we've got here as far as the common objections to the doctrine of the Trinity is this. As I said, JWs, modalists, Unitarians, Muslims, they all have these same basic objections. But again, the Bible tells us to make the most of our time, for the days are evil. You don't have to take days and hours and hours and hours to witness to someone if you can do it a lot quicker. So what we want to do is be efficient in the time that we have. So you start by remove their foundation for objection. Then you go into now explain distinctions to them. And now when you start going through the common objections, now they're going to say, yeah, that actually makes sense. That actually makes sense. So, but what about, remember we dealt with the 30-in-1 and the 3-in-1, that somehow it necessarily divide gods into parts? It doesn't. So in the next segment, I'll go into the objections proper. So let's take a quick break and come back.